The gun was already loaded when Maude Brenner pressed it against her own temple. She was not going to pull the trigger. She needed to believe that about herself, even as her fingers trembled against the cold steel, and the Nevada wind howled through the cracks in the abandoned barn where she had taken shelter for the third night running. She needed to believe she was stronger than this moment, stronger than the accumulated wreckage of 31 years of living, stronger than the grief that had hollowed her out so completely that she sometimes pressed her palm flat against her sternum just to check whether a heart still beat there. It did. It always did. That was the cruelest part. The revolver belonged to her dead husband. She had carried it across 4 states and 2 mountain ranges, not because she intended to use it on herself, or so she had told herself every morning when she loaded it into her saddlebag. But tonight the horse was gone, stolen by the man in Elko who had offered her a warm meal and then taken everything else she owned while she slept, and the saddlebag was gone with the horse, and the only thing she still had was the gun because she had tucked it inside her coat when she lay down to rest, the cold metal against her ribs a strange comfort, the way a scar can feel familiar. So here she was, 31 years old, a widow twice over. A woman who had buried a child, a woman who had watched a drought take a farm, a fire take a home, a fever take a daughter who had only just learned to say the word mama with that particular sunrise-bright delight that small children have, and then a wagon accident take a second husband before the year of mourning for the first was even properly finished. Every season had taken something, every single one. She lowered the gun, not because she found some transcendent reason to live in that moment, not because a voice from heaven spoke to her. She lowered it because her hand cramped from the cold and the barrel slipped, and when it slipped she startled, and when she startled she gasped, and the gasp was loud enough that it woke the dog. She had not known there was a dog in the barn. It was a large, honey-colored animal with the calm eyes of something that had seen considerable hardship and chosen gentleness anyway, and it stood up from the dark corner where it had been sleeping in the straw, walked directly to her, sat down, and put its enormous head on her knee. Maude Brenner stared at it. Then she put the gun down in the straw, and she put both her hands on the dog's warm skull, and she cried in a way she had not allowed herself to cry since the fever took Clara 2 years ago. She was still crying when the barn door opened. The lantern light came first, yellow and swinging, throwing long shadows across the straw-covered floor, and then the man came in behind it. He was tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the doorframe, broad-shouldered in a sheepskin coat that had seen many winters, with dark hair silvering at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red sandstone that formed the canyon walls outside. He stopped when he saw her. His eyes went immediately to the gun in the straw, and something moved across his face, fast and complicated, before he brought it under control. "That is my dog," he said, which was not what she had expected him to say at all. "I can see that," she said. Her voice came out raw and strange from the crying. "She is called Pepper," he said. "I have been looking for her for 2 hours. She gets out through a gap in the fence post near the creek." He did not move any closer. He kept his voice level and ordinary, the way a man keeps his voice when he is being very deliberate about the choice to be calm. "You are on my property." "I know," Maude said. "I am sorry. I had nowhere else." The man looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the gun. He looked at her face, which she knew must be wrecked, red-eyed, terrible. He looked at her coat, which was thin for the November cold. He looked at her hands, which had nothing in them now except dog fur. "Come up to the house," he said. She opened her mouth to refuse. "It is below freezing tonight," he said, "and you do not have a horse." She closed her mouth. She picked up the gun and put it in her coat pocket, and she followed him and his lantern and his dog out of the barn, and across a frozen yard toward a house with lit windows. And that was how Maude Brenner met George McCrae. She had not always been a woman running from everything she had ever loved. There was a version of her life, a real one, not imagined, where she had been a girl who could name every bird by its call, and who had learned to read from a father who believed firmly that ignorance was a choice and an insult. She had grown up in Missouri, in a small town called Hannibal, in a house with a green-painted door that her mother kept fresh every spring. Her first marriage had been a good one. Thomas Brenner was a farmer with kind eyes and a laugh that came easy, and they had been married in 1876 when she was 20 years old and he was 23. They homesteaded in Kansas, which was a mistake geographically but a valid one emotionally, because Kansas in the late 1870s still looked like possibility. Their daughter Clara was born in 1878, a red-faced, furious, beautiful creature who became, within the space of 18 months, the organizing principle of Maude's entire existence. The drought came in 1879. Then the grasshoppers. Then the bank, which Thomas had borrowed from the previous spring, came and said the words that banks say when they have decided they are done being patient. They lost the farm. They packed what they could carry into a wagon and headed west because west was still the direction that meant something might be different. Clara caught scarlet fever outside of Denver in 1880. She was buried in a churchyard with a wooden marker that Maude knew would not survive the first hard winter, which made the grave feel somehow doubly lost, as if her daughter were dying twice. Thomas held her through that grief, and she held him, and they kept moving because stopping felt like giving up and giving up felt like dishonoring Clara's memory. They got as far as Utah, where Thomas found work with a mining operation. He was careful. He was not reckless. The wagon that killed him was not even his wagon. It was a supply wagon with a broken wheel brace and a driver who had been drinking since morning, and it came around a blind corner at speed and caught Thomas walking along the trail road, and that was that. 1881, a Tuesday in March. She remarried 2 years later in 1883. Her second husband was a man named Robert Hale, a decent enough man, a widower himself with no children and a dry goods store in a small Nevada town. She did not love him the way she had loved Thomas. She was honest with herself about that. But she respected him, and she thought she could build something with respect as the foundation, something quieter and smaller but still good. Robert died of a heart attack in his sleep in 1885. She was 30 years old. She had been a widow twice in 4 years. The dry goods store went to Robert's brother, who drove out from Ohio with the legal paperwork already prepared, which told her everything she needed to know about how long that man had been waiting. She was left with the contents of her room, her dead first husband's revolver, a horse, and about $40 in coin. Then the man in Elko stole the horse and the coin while she slept, and that was how she found herself in a stranger's barn in November of 1885 with a gun in her hand and a dog on her knee. The house was warmer than she remembered warmth being. George McCrae had a cast iron stove in the kitchen that radiated heat like a small sun, and he put a kettle on it without asking, and pointed her to a chair at the kitchen table without fuss or performance of hospitality. He simply moved through the space like a man in his own home, which he was, and Maude sat down and felt the warmth begin to work on her frozen bones and watched him. He was older than she had first thought, or perhaps it was just the way the indoor light caught the silver in his hair. She revised her estimate to somewhere in his early 40s, though she would find out later he was 38, not so much older than her as the gray made him appear. He moved with the particular economy of a man who had been working physically his whole life, no motion wasted, every action precise. He put a cup of tea in front of her without asking whether she wanted it. He put a plate of cornbread beside that. He sat down on the other side of the table and folded his large hands together and looked at her with eyes that were a shade of brown she could not name exactly, warm but serious like old wood. "You want to tell me what is happening with you," he said. It was not quite a question. "Not particularly," she said. He nodded. "Fair enough. How far is the nearest town?" "Ridge Creek, 4 miles east." He paused. "There is no stage until Thursday. Today is Monday." She absorbed that. Thursday. 3 days. "I can sleep in the barn," she said. "You can sleep in the spare room," he said. "It is warm and it has a door with a latch on the inside." "I am not the man in whatever story put that expression on your face." She looked at him directly for the first time since they had sat down. He met her gaze without flinching, without performing offense, without any of the social machinery men usually employed. He just looked at her, patient, and let her make up her own mind. She ate the cornbread. She drank the tea. "I am Maude Brenner," she said. "George McCrae," he said. She slept in the spare room that night, with the latch thrown and the revolver on the nightstand, and she slept for 10 hours straight, which was the longest she had slept in over a year. In the morning, she found that George had already been up for hours. Through the kitchen window she could see him in the yard, breaking ice on the water trough for the horses, his breath making clouds in the cold air. The dog, Pepper, sat watching him with devoted attention. She found coffee already made on the stove and helped herself and stood at the window watching him work. This was his life. She could see the shape of it clearly, the way you can see the shape of a valley from a high ridge. There was the main house, solid and well built, a man's house with practical furniture and no unnecessary ornament. There was the barn, a smaller stable, 2 outbuildings. Beyond those, the land opened into a broad, flat-bottomed valley with canyon walls rising red and bronze on 3 sides, and beyond those, mountains still holding their snow. The valley itself was winter-brown, but she could see from the fencing and the lie of the land that in warmer months it would be a proper cattle operation, not enormous but not struggling either. He came in for coffee and found her at the window and did not comment on the fact that she had been watching him. "Sleep all right?" he asked. "Better than I have in a long time," she admitted. He poured his coffee and stood beside her at the window, looking out at his valley. "I need to get to Ridge Creek Thursday and find work," she said, "and I need to wire for some money if I have anyone left to wire." "Do you?" She thought about it honestly. Her parents were both gone. She had one aunt in St. Louis who she had not spoken to in 5 years, a woman who had opinions about Maude's life choices that she had not been shy about sharing. "I am not certain," she said. He nodded slowly. "There is work here if you want it," he said. "Between now and the spring thaw, I am understaffed. My housekeeper went back to her daughter in Sacramento in October. I have 2 ranch hands, but neither of them knows anything about a kitchen or keeping a house properly, and I have been eating my own cooking, which is a situation that has been getting worse by the week." She looked at him. "It is a legitimate offer," he said. "Wages, room, and board. I'm not a man who buries the real meaning of things under polite words, Mrs. Brenner. If I had another intention, I would say so plainly and accept the answer. That is an unusual thing for a man to say." "I have been told I am an unusual man." She considered. Thursday was 4 miles away, and she had no horse and no money and nowhere specific she was going when she got there. The spare room had a latch. He had looked at her face in the barn with the gun in her hand and chosen to say, "Come to the house." "What are the wages?" she said. He told her they were fair. "All right," she said. "Through the spring thaw," he nodded. "Through the spring thaw. That was the agreement. Clean, simple, transactional. Maude Brenner was very careful to keep it that way, at least in her own mind, for the first several weeks. She threw herself into the work with an energy that surprised even her, scrubbing and organizing and cooking, with a focus that felt almost like aggression. George's house had the clean but not tended quality of a bachelor's home, surfaces wiped but corners neglected, food stores organized by size rather than type, a pantry that held 17 cans of peaches and almost no actual staples. She reorganized the pantry on her second day. She found a list of what needed to be ordered and left it on the kitchen table. George looked at it that evening, turned it over, added 3 things in handwriting that was surprisingly neat for a rancher, and left it back on the table without comment. She made bread that first week and left half a loaf on the table when she knew he would be coming in for his midday meal. She went back to her work and heard him come in and heard the silence of a man eating bread still warm from the oven. And something about that silence was deeply satisfying to her in a way she could not have articulated. His 2 ranch hands were a Mexican man of about 50 named Esteban, who had been with George for 12 years and who treated Maude with respectful reserve, until she produced a pot of pinto beans cooked the way his mother had cooked them, at which point his reserve dissolved completely, and a younger man of 23 named Cal, who was cheerful and careless and ate everything put in front of him with equal and enormous enthusiasm. Esteban told her things about George that George would never have told her himself. He was married, Esteban said one afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table while Maude rolled pie crust in that easy way people talk when their hands are occupied, each bent over their own task. Her name was Grace. She died 7 years ago, fever. Maude kept rolling the crust. Children, a boy, he died with her. Esteban was quiet for a moment. He built this place up again after. Before Grace died, it was not so good. After, it became what you see now. I think he put everything into the land because there was nowhere else to put it. Maude understood that so precisely and completely that it took a deliberate effort not to say so. He is a private man, Esteban said. I noticed, she said, but he is a good man. In this part of the territory, that is worth saying specifically. Esteban looked at her with the directness of someone who had decided to trust her with information. He does not take what does not belong to him. He does not speak about women the way some men do. He pays a fair wage and keeps it even when the cattle prices drop. There are not many ranchers I could say all of those things about. Maude did not respond to that directly. She put the pie crust in the pan and began to trim the edges. But she thought about it that evening, sitting by the kitchen stove with a mending basket while the wind found every gap in the walls, and the fire snapped, and Pepper lay across her feet with the perfect, uncomplicated warmth of a dog who had decided where she wanted to be. George came in from his last check of the horses and took off his coat and hung it on the peg by the door and turned to find her there, which made him pause for just a fraction of a second, as if he had not yet adjusted to the house being occupied in the evening. There is stew on the stove, she said. I can smell it, he said. He went to the stove and served himself a bowl and sat down at the table, not in his usual chair but in the one closer to the stove, which was also the one closer to where she was sitting, and she was not certain whether that was deliberate or not. They sat in silence for a while, which was comfortable in a way that surprised her. Can I ask you something? She said. You can. This valley, does it have a name? He looked at the wall for a moment as if seeing through it to the land outside. McCrae Valley on the deed. Everyone around here just calls it the McCrae place. He paused. I have always just called it home. Even when it was empty, I called it that. She turned that over in her mind. That is a rare thing, she said, to have a place that feels like home. He looked at her then, really looked, the way he had looked at her in the barn, but with the difference that they were now inside in the warm after 3 weeks of ordinary days that had built something between them that neither of them had named yet. Have you had that? He asked. A place like that. She thought about the green door in Hannibal. She thought about the Kansas homestead, which had felt like the beginning of something before the drought. She thought about the Utah boarding house where she had sat with Thomas's body and waited for the undertaker. She thought about the room above Robert Hale's dry goods store. Once, she said, a long time ago. He nodded and did not push, which she appreciated. December came in hard, the way December comes in Nevada high desert country, sudden and serious. The pass north of the valley closed under 4 feet of snow in the first week, and the temperature at night dropped low enough that George had her hang extra blankets over the windows to keep the glass from cracking. The cattle had to be checked every morning and evening, and George and Esteban and Cal spent their days in the cold, while Maude kept the house running, and the food coming, and began to understand, in a deeply physical way, how much labor was required simply to sustain life in this place. She also began to understand George McCrae in ways that were separate from what Esteban had told her. She learned these things through proximity and attention, the way you learn a landscape by living in it. He woke before dawn every day without apparent effort or resentment. He read at night by lamplight, history mostly, and once she had cataloged the books on his shelf, she could see the shape of his interior life in them. A man interested in how things came to be the way they were, how empires rose and fell, how land changed hands, how ordinary people made decisions in extraordinary circumstances. He was not a man who talked much, but when he did speak, his words were considered and often surprising. He had opinions about things she would not have expected a cattle rancher to have opinions about, and he held them with conviction but without arrogance, and he would change his mind if presented with a good enough argument, which she discovered by accident one afternoon when she disagreed with something he said about the management of the South pasture, and laid out her reasoning and found, to her astonishment, that he listened, actually listened, and then said, "You might be right about that." She discovered she had missed being listened to. She also discovered, more slowly and with more resistance, that she had missed being seen. It happened in small ways. The way he noticed when she was tired and did not pile more expectations onto the evening. The way he moved around her in the kitchen without collision or awkwardness, as if they had been navigating the same space for years. The way he brought in extra wood without being asked on the coldest days, leaving it stacked near the door where she would not have to go out for it. One evening in late December she was standing at the kitchen window watching snow fall in the lamplight, and she realized she had not thought about the gun in her coat pocket for 3 weeks. She had not thought about the barn. She had not thought about any of the things that had led her there. She was not healed. She was not foolish enough to think 3 weeks of warmth and work and regular meals had undone years of loss, but something had shifted. Some calculation inside her that had been running the same terrible numbers over and over had begun to run different numbers, and the answer was no longer 0. Christmas came. George McCrae was not a man who made much of holidays, but Esteban's wife Maria, who lived with their grown daughter in Ridge Creek and came out to the ranch periodically, arrived on Christmas Eve in a wagon loaded with tamales and a small pine tree she had cut herself along the road, and the kitchen became warm in a different way than it had been, loud with Spanish and English and the dog underfoot trying to steal tamales. And George sat at the head of his table with the expression of a man who had not expected to find this in his home and did not entirely know what to do with it. Maude caught his eye across the table and he looked briefly startled, as if she had caught him thinking something private, and then the corner of his mouth curved up. It was not a full smile. She would not see a full smile from George McCrae until January. But that corner of his mouth turning up was something she thought about later, in her room, with Pepper curled at the foot of the bed, and she thought about it longer than she had any intention of thinking about it. On Christmas Day, after the others had gone home and Cal had retired to the bunkhouse with a generous pour of whiskey, George came into the kitchen and set a small package on the table near where she was washing dishes. "I had Maria pick it up in Ridge Creek," he said. He said it in a way that minimized the gesture before she could even respond to it. She dried her hands and opened it. It was a pair of wool gloves, good ones, lined with rabbit fur, and they fit her hands as if they had been made for them. She held them for a moment. "How did you know my size?" she asked. "You left a pair of the old ones drying by the stove last week," he said. "They were falling apart." She put the gloves on. They were exactly right. "Thank you, George," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. She had been careful about that, keeping it formal, keeping the architecture of the arrangement clear. His name in her mouth felt like stepping through a door. He was quiet for a moment. "You are welcome, Maude," he said. Her name in his mouth felt like the door swinging both ways. January was when things became complicated, not between them exactly, but around them in a way that forced a clarification neither of them had been prepared to make. A man came to the ranch in the second week of January. He arrived on a good horse and wore a good coat, and had the look of a man who had spent money carefully and wanted you to know it. His name was Dale Ferris, and he was, Esteban told her privately and with a particular flatness to his voice, someone who had been trying to buy George's ranch for 3 years. George received him in the front room while Maude stayed in the kitchen, but the house was not large, and the conversation carried. Ferris had raised his offer considerably. He spoke about it in the smooth, patient tones of a man who believed everything had its price, and he simply needed to find the number. He spoke about the valley as if it were a commodity, which Maude supposed it was to him. He spoke about how George was running a one-man operation, said with the condescension of someone who thinks they are being neutral, and how the market for beef was going to shift in the next 5 years toward the larger consolidated operations, and how George would do well to take the money now while it was still good. George's voice, when it came, was quiet and absolutely final. "No," he said. Ferris tried several more angles. George said no to each one. When Ferris left, Maude heard the front door close and then nothing for a while. She was taking bread out of the oven when George came into the kitchen. He sat down at the table and looked at the grain of the wood. "He comes every few months," he said without her asking. "Started after Grace died. I think he thought grief might do what money could not. Did it work? No," he paused. "This land is not mine in the way he means. I did not build it to sell it. I built it because he stopped." She waited. "Because my father owned 30 acres in Virginia and sharecropped on a man's land for 20 years and died without ever having something that was purely his," George said. "I came west because out here a man could have something that was his. I have had this valley for 14 years. I am not selling it to Dale Ferris." Maude set the bread on the cooling rack. "He will keep coming back," she said. "No, and when the spring market is bad it will be tempting. I know that too." He looked at her. "Are you trying to talk me into selling?" "Absolutely not," she said with such immediate certainty that he blinked. "I think you are exactly right about it. I just wanted to know you had thought about the hard version." He studied her for a moment. "Most people tell me to take the money," he said. "Most people have not been here long enough to understand what the money would actually cost," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "How long do you intend to stay?" he said. The question sat between them, heavier than its surface weight. "Through the spring thaw," she said. "That was the agreement." "Agreements can be renegotiated," he said. She did not answer immediately. She picked up a cloth and wiped down the counter that did not need wiping. "George," she said. "Maude, I am not a woman who is easy to be around," she said. "I have been through enough things that I am not soft anywhere. I do not have soft left in me. I am practical and I am sometimes short and I carry things I have never put down." "I have noticed," he said. "I have also noticed that you are steady, that you are honest, that you work without complaint, that you have made this house feel like a house again instead of a place where I sleep." He paused. "I am not asking you to be soft. I am asking you to consider staying." She looked at him then, really looked. "I buried 2 husbands and a daughter," she said. "I am 31 years old and I feel sometimes like I am 100. I buried a wife and a son," he said. "I am 38. I know exactly how that feels." The fire in the stove made its small sounds. The wind outside was down to a murmur. Pepper came in from wherever she had been and clicked across the kitchen floor and settled under the table. "Let me think about it," Maude said. He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup and went back to his work, and he did not press her, and she stood at the counter long after she had stopped wiping it. She thought about it for 2 weeks, which was not really 2 weeks of abstract deliberation, but 2 weeks of paying more careful attention to what was already there. She paid attention to how she felt when she heard him come in from the cold. She paid attention to the quality of the silence when they were in the same room. She paid attention to the fact that she had begun, without consciously deciding to cook things she thought he would like specifically. Not just food that was available, and that she noticed, equally without deciding to, which way he preferred his coffee, and at what point in the morning he liked to eat versus just drink. She paid attention to the way he looked at her when she was not looking at him, which she noticed because she was also looking at him when he was not looking at her. And twice they caught each other at it, and both looked away with the studied casualness of 2 people who have been found out. She paid attention to the fact that she had told him things she had told no one. About Clara. About the shape of that grief, the specific texture of it, the way it did not diminish so much as become part of the architecture of everything. He had listened in the way she had always needed to be listened to but had rarely been, with full attention, and without the impulse to minimize or redirect. She also paid attention to the fact that she was afraid. She was profoundly, genuinely afraid. Not of George McCrae, not of the ranch or the valley or the work. She was afraid of wanting something again. She was afraid of the specific vulnerability of caring about a place and having it taken. She was afraid of loving a person and then standing next to a grave in the frozen ground. She had done it more than once, and the knowledge of what it cost sat in her chest like a stone. It was Esteban who, indirectly and without knowing it, broke the deadlock. She was in the barn in late January, helping with a difficult calving because George and Cal were both out on the far pasture and Esteban needed another pair of hands, and they worked together for 2 cold, messy hours and saved the calf. And afterward, when they were cleaning up with water that kept wanting to freeze, Esteban said, in that easy way he had of saying important things in the middle of ordinary conversation, "He is a better man since you came. He sleeps better. He laughs sometimes now." "I have not seen him laugh in years." Maude wrung out her cloth. "I know it is none of my business," Esteban said, "but I have been with him through the hard years. He deserves the good ones." She thought about that all afternoon, and then she thought about herself, which was the harder direction to think. She had told herself so many times and in so many ways that she was done building things that could be taken, done opening herself to the particular devastation of love, done beginning things. She had told herself that survival was enough, that getting through each day was a sufficient ambition, but she was surviving here, and it was not enough, not anymore. She found George in the stable that evening, working on a piece of tack by lamplight, his hands moving with the automatic skill of long practice. She stood in the stable doorway for a moment and looked at him, at the shape of him in the yellow lamplight, at the silver in his hair and the careful way his hands moved and the expression on his face that was simply a man doing his work in his place. "I want to stay," she said. He looked up from the leather. He looked at her steadily. "I am afraid," she said. "I want you to know that I am afraid. I am not coming to this from a place of certainty. I am coming to it from a place of deciding that fear is not a good enough reason to leave something real." He set down the tack. He stood up. "I am afraid too," he said. "Every day since Grace I have been afraid. I do not think fear goes away. I think you carry it with you and work around it." She crossed the distance between the doorway and where he was standing, which was not far, and she stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. "I am not Grace," she said. "I know exactly who you are," he said. He lifted one hand and touched her face, just his fingertips against her cheek, the first time he had touched her since he had held a lantern in the barn and let her choose to follow him. She reached up and put her hand over his. They stood like that for a moment in the lamplit stable, with the horses shifting quietly in their stalls and the cold air carrying the smell of hay and leather and horses, which was, she thought, as honest a smell as any place could have. Then he kissed her, or she kissed him. She could never quite say afterward who moved first, and it was not a careful kiss. It was the kiss of 2 people who had been holding something tightly for a long time and had decided together to let it go. February was a revelation. She had been afraid that what she felt was simply gratitude, or loneliness, or the warmth of a house after a long cold. She had been afraid that it was a dependency born of having nothing, that without the desperation she would not feel anything. February showed her she was wrong about that. The feeling she had for George McCrae was not quiet or cautious or provisional. It was specific and certain and daily and growing. It was the feeling of knowing someone, really knowing them, not the romantic performance of knowing, but the actual knowledge of how they think and what they value and where their pain lives. It was the feeling of being known back. She had not expected to trust again. That was the thing she had been most certain about, that her capacity for trust had been used up, burned through by loss and by the gradual accumulation of disappointments that life in the 1880s dealt out to women who had no one to protect them. She had expected to negotiate this, to build something strategic and safe. Instead, she found herself trusting George McCrae with a completeness that frightened and clarified her simultaneously. He was direct in all things. When something was wrong with the cattle, he told her plainly. When his finances were tight in a month where they were, he did not hide it. When she asked him about his past, he told her without the defensive maneuver she had grown accustomed to from men who had things they did not want examined. When he was struggling with something, she could see it on him, and he did not pretend otherwise. And he was tender, privately and without advertisement. He left wildflowers, the few that were still alive under the snow, dried and pressed, on her windowsill in mid-February, and said nothing about it. He repaired a chair in her room that had a wobble in it without being asked. He remembered everything she told him, not because he was performing attention, but because he actually retained it, and would refer back to things she had said weeks ago in a way that told her she had been heard. She started laughing again in February. It crept up on her, the first time, a real laugh at something Esteban said that was genuinely funny, and she heard it come out of herself, and realized she had not made that sound and she could not even calculate how long. George was across the kitchen when it happened, and he looked at her with an expression that was open in a way she had not seen on him before, vulnerable and pleased, and then he smiled. The full smile for the first time, and it changed his whole face, made him look younger, made him look like the man he must have been before grief had carved lines into him. She thought, I want to make him look like that as many times as possible for as long as I live. The thought did not frighten her. It clarified her. In early March, when the valley was still mostly frozen but you could smell the intention of spring somewhere under the cold, Dale Ferris came back. He came with a lawyer this time, a precise little man in a suit that was too thin for the Nevada winter, and he had papers with him. And the papers were, Ferris explained with the smooth authority of a man who had prepared this very carefully, a legal challenge to the title of the northern portion of the McCrae land, specifically the water rights to the creek that ran through the north pasture, which, Ferris's lawyer argued, had been improperly recorded in 1871. George stood in his front room and read the papers with the stillness of a man who does not move when he is angry. Maude stood beside him and read them over his shoulder. This is a fabrication, she said. She had read enough of Robert Hale's business documents, and before that had grown up with a father who was careful about such things, to know what a properly executed land filing looked like. The recording reference they are citing is wrong. This creek was part of the original homestead filing, not a separate water rights claim. Both men looked at her with varying degrees of surprise. Ferris's lawyer with professional neutrality, Ferris with something closer to irritation. The recording office is in Ridge Creek, George said, still looking at the papers. Then we go to Ridge Creek, she said. Ferris smiled the smile of a man who has prepared for every response. The original filing records were damaged in the fire 2 years ago, he said. Not all of them, Maude said. Survey records and the homestead patent from the Federal Land Office are held separately. They cannot be destroyed by a local fire because they are not kept locally. They are in Carson City. Silence. The lawyer made a note. Mrs. Brenner is correct, the lawyer said, in the neutral tone of a man who is not paid to be on anyone's side. Ferris's smile narrowed. I will need 2 weeks to write to Carson City, George said. He folded the papers and handed them back to Ferris with a deliberate calm that was more powerful than any display of anger could have been. When the patent records are confirmed, I will expect you not to come back to this property. Ferris and his lawyer left. In the hall, George stood holding the edge of the doorframe and breathed. Then he turned to look at her. Where did you learn that about the Federal Land Office records? My second husband had a land dispute with a neighbor, she said. I read everything I could find about land law because Robert was a man who needed things explained to him twice and then needed someone else to organize the response. I did not expect it to be useful quite like this. George looked at her for a long moment. You are remarkable, he said, simply and without inflation. She felt the heat come up in her face, which was not a reaction she had expected and which she hoped was not visible. I am practical, she said. Those things are not mutually exclusive, he said. The records from Carson City came in 3 weeks and confirmed everything she had said. A letter from George's attorney was sent to Ferris. Ferris did not return. Spring came to the McCrae Valley the way it always came there, George told her, not gradually but suddenly, like a decision. One morning in late March she woke to the sound of water moving, the creek running free for the first time since November, and she lay in her warm bed and listened to it and thought, "This is what beginning sounds like." She went to the kitchen and found George already at the table with coffee, and he looked up when she came in and said, "It thawed overnight," and she said, "I heard it." And they sat together while the new light came through the windows and the valley outside dripped and ran and made its spring sounds. "I would like you to stay on permanently," George said. His voice was as direct and plain as always, but there was something underneath it that was not plain at all. Not as a housekeeper, as more than that. As he paused, and the pause was the most human thing she had seen from him, the small gap where the composed man inside him ran out of architecture and just stood in the open. "I have been trying to find the right way to say this for weeks." "Then say it the way it actually is," she said. He looked at her. "I love you," he said. "I did not expect to. I was not looking for it. But I have been watching you all winter, and I cannot imagine this valley without you in it, and I am asking you to marry me if you are willing." She had thought about this. She had thought about it carefully and from every angle in the way she thought about everything that mattered, circling it, examining the foundations. She knew all the reasons not to. She could recite them in her sleep. She also knew what she felt, which was something she had stopped trusting and then, slowly, over the course of one Nevada winter, learned to trust again. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and his hand was warm and large and certain. And she looked at the clasped hands on the table and thought about the green door in Hannibal, and about Kansas, and about Clara, and about Thomas and Robert and all the long road of loss that had led her to a barn in November with a gun. And then here, to this kitchen, to this man, to this valley, where the creek was running free in the March morning. Every season had taken something. And now, finally, here was a season that was giving something back. They were married in April in the Ridge Creek Church, a small ceremony with Esteban and Maria and Cal, and the minister, and a handful of neighboring ranchers who were curious about the woman George McCrae had apparently been hiding all winter. Maude wore a dress that Maria had helped her make from blue wool, which was not white, because she was not a woman who was going to pretend at something for the sake of convention. And George stood at the front of the church with his good coat and his silver-touched hair, and watched her walk down the aisle with an expression that she would describe to her grandchildren someday as a man seeing something he had stopped believing in and finding it real. The ceremony was short because neither of them had any patience for ceremony. The party afterward at the ranch house was longer, because everyone they had invited had been waiting for an excuse to eat Maria's cooking and drink George's good whiskey, and the evening went on longer than planned, which was exactly right. When everyone was gone and the house was quiet again, George found Maude at the kitchen window for the second time in their story, this time looking out at the valley in the April starlight, the snow almost completely gone from the lower slopes, the creek a bright line in the darkness. He came to stand beside her. "All right," he said. "Better than that," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they stood together looking out at the valley he had built out of grief, and she had arrived at out of desperation, and which now, in some way that neither of them would have been able to explain to a skeptic, but that was absolutely real to both of them, belonged to both of them. The summer that followed was the first full season she had spent in the valley, and it showed her what the land was when it was not under snow. The grass grew deep in the flat bottom of the valley, and the cattle moved through it in long, peaceful lines, and the canyon walls turned from winter red to a softer brown gold in the long afternoons, and the creek was clear and cold and smelled of snow melt and pine. She learned the rhythms of a working cattle ranch in the warm months, which were different from the winter rhythms. She learned the language of it, not just the work but the seasonal logic, the decisions that had to be made about which cattle to sell and when, about the state of the South pasture versus the North, about where the fencing needed reinforcing, and which water sources were reliable in a dry July. George taught her, patiently and without condescension, everything she asked to learn. She had questions about everything and she asked them plainly, and he answered them the same way. Within 6 weeks, she could read the condition of the cattle as well as he could. Within 3 months, she was making suggestions about the operation that he took seriously, and twice revised his plans to incorporate them. He told her one evening in June, sitting on the porch in the long light, that she was the best business mind he had encountered in 14 years of ranching, which she took as the highest compliment he could have offered, and told him so. He laughed. It was becoming a sound she heard regularly now, and it never stopped making her feel the particular pleasure of having found something that had been lost. In July, a woman came to the valley from the north, a Paiute woman named Nunu, who had been displaced from her family's traditional lands by a federal order issued the previous year as part of the ongoing dispossession that was grinding through the Nevada territory with the slow violence of official policy. She came to the ranch looking for work, any work, with the dignity of a person who needed something, and had decided that dignity was more important than pretending otherwise. George was in the north pasture when she arrived, and Maude received her at the door. She saw Nunu clearly, a woman perhaps 10 years older than herself, with a face that held the specific kind of endurance Maude recognized from the mirror. She invited her inside and made coffee and listened to her situation with full attention. When George came in that evening, Maude told him what she had learned. "She knows horses," Maude said, "better than cow. She told me things about the bay gelding's near hind leg that match exactly what you have been saying about him favoring it. She has nowhere to go and she has skills we need." George did not hesitate. "Offer her the housekeeper's wage," he said. "Esteban can tell you if that is fair for the horsework." Esteban said it was more than fair. Nunu accepted and took the small room above the stable that had been empty since a previous hand had left. She was quiet but not closed, observant in the way of someone who had learned that careful attention is a survival skill. Maude and Nunu developed, slowly and without ceremony, a working friendship that was built on the solid ground of mutual competence and mutual respect. It was Nunu who told Maude in September, watching her in the kitchen with the particular attention of someone who notices bodies, that she thought Maude might be expecting. Maude sat down in the nearest chair. She was not prepared for what she felt, which was not simple joy and not simple fear, but something larger and more complicated than either, a kind of full-body reckoning. She had buried Clara. She had carried that loss for 5 years. She had, in some interior room that she had kept very carefully locked, told herself that she was not going to love a child again, was not going to make herself that vulnerable again. She sat in the kitchen for a long time. Then she went to find George, who was in the barn repairing a harness, and she stood in the barn doorway for the second time in their story, in the same spot where she had told him she wanted to stay, and she said, "I think I am going to have a child." He looked at her. She watched his face move through several things very quickly. He put down the harness. He came to her and took both her hands in his and looked at her with those warm brown eyes. "Are you frightened?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Enormously." "So am I," he said. "We will be frightened together." She gripped his hands hard. "I need you to know about Clara," she said. "I have told you before, but I need you to really know what it cost, what I am risking." "I know," he said. "I buried a son. I know exactly what you are risking." They stood in the barn doorway together, holding onto each other, while the September evening came in gold and long over the valley. "All right," she said. "All right, then, we do this." The pregnancy progressed through the autumn and into the winter, the second winter she spent in the valley, and this winter was different from the first in every way. She was not a refugee this time. She was a woman in her home, growing large and slow, moving through familiar rooms with the particular self-possession of someone who belongs to a place and knows it. George was attentive without being suffocating, which was the exact calibration she needed and which she suspected he knew. He did not treat her like something breakable. He did not stop consulting her about the ranch. He did not change the nature of how he talked to her or what he shared with her. He simply added, without comment, the practical accommodations that a winter pregnancy required. He carried the heavy things. He made sure the path between the house and the stable was always cleared before she needed it. He sat with her in the evenings, reading, or sometimes just talking. Long conversations about the ranch and the territory, and what they thought the next decade would look like for people trying to hold on to their land. And sometimes they talked about smaller things, about Esteban and Cal and Nunu, and what kind of life the people in their orbit were building. And sometimes they talked about Clara, and about Grace, and the small boy who had never gotten a name because he died within hours of his birth. And these conversations were not sad, exactly, or not only sad. They were the conversations of two people who have decided to carry their pasts together. The baby was born on a cold, clear morning in February 1887. The same month, George noted quietly that the valley always started to think about spring, still frozen but with that underlying intention you could sense if you knew the land. It was a boy. He was born with George's dark hair and Maude's gray eyes, and he was loud and furious and absolutely perfect. And Maude held him for the first hour and cried the way she had cried in the barn with the dog on her knee, but completely differently, from a completely different place. She named him Thomas, for her first husband, because Thomas Brenner had been a good man who deserved to be remembered, and she thought it was right. George said nothing for a moment when she told him the name and then said, quietly, that it was a good name, and she loved him more for that acceptance than for almost anything else he had done. She loved him more than she had known she was capable of loving anyone after everything that had been taken from her. This was the discovery of her 33rd year, that the capacity for love is not a finite resource. It does not deplete. Loss had made her believe that it did, had made her feel like a vessel with a hole in it, always running empty. But the vessel had not been running empty. It had been filling up from beneath, slowly and without her noticing, and now it was full and then some. Thomas McCrae was a confident, cheerful baby who became a confident, cheerful infant who was spoiled beyond reason by Esteban and Maria, who took to calling him Mijo, and by Cal, who could be found on most evenings making the baby laugh by means that became increasingly elaborate and slightly undignified as time went on, and by Nunu, who made him a small woven blanket in the pattern of her people, and who held him with the gravity of someone paying a debt to the future. And by his parents who were, Maude thought, and said to George one evening when Thomas was asleep in his cradle and they were sitting together in the kitchen in the familiar quiet of their evenings, unreasonably happy for people who had each been through what they had been through. Maybe that is why it is so complete, George said, because we know what the other side looks like. Maybe, she said. She looked at him across the table. You have gray in your hair. I have had gray in my hair since before you arrived, he said. I know, I have always liked it. She paused. I want you to know that I have always liked it. I do not say that kind of thing often enough. He reached across the table in the way he had done on the morning she said yes, and she took his hand. Outside, the Nevada stars were doing what Nevada stars did in February, filling the sky with extravagant cold fire, and the creek was silent under its ice but already, if you knew to listen for it, beginning to murmur in its deepest part where the freeze had not reached, thinking about spring. The following years were full ones. Not without difficulty, because life on a cattle ranch in Nevada in the late 1880s had no shortage of difficulty, and she had not signed up for an easy life and would not have known what to do with one. The beef market had its bad years, and they were careful in those years and weathered them. A stretch of drought in 1889 dried up one of the secondary water sources, and they worked through it with the systematic problem-solving of two people who thought well together under pressure. Dale Ferris did not come back to the ranch, but his name appeared twice in connection with land consolidation schemes in the northern part of the territory that were doing to smaller ranchers what he had tried to do to George. And George testified against one of those schemes at a territorial hearing in Carson City in 1890, which was the first time Maude had gone with him to the city. And she found herself in the unfamiliar position of sitting in the gallery of a formal hearing and being intensely proud of the plain, careful, precise way her husband laid out the facts. She was also, by that point, 5 months pregnant again. Their second child arrived in the summer of 1890 and was a girl. They named her Clara, after the daughter Maude had buried, and this naming was the most deliberate thing Maude had ever done, a decision she had thought about for months. She did not want to erase the first Clara or to replace her, which was impossible. She wanted to carry her name forward into a life that was good as a way of saying, she existed, she mattered, and the world she left is still worth being born into. George understood this completely. He did not need to have it explained. Clara McCrae was born with her mother's determination and her father's patience, a remarkable combination that would serve her well her whole life. And she was different from Thomas in every way that siblings can be different. Where Thomas was loud, she was quiet. Where Thomas was impulsive, she was deliberate. And together, they were a household that was constantly surprising and never boring. Nunu stayed on at the ranch through all of this, and the friendship between her and Maude deepened into something that was less like a working relationship and more like the friendship of two women who had chosen each other, which was the most important kind. Maude helped Nunu draft a formal complaint to the territorial Indian agent about the land order that had displaced her family, a complaint that went through several iterations and several months of careful wording, and ultimately achieved a partial accommodation, not the full restoration that justice would have demanded, and that neither of them was naive enough to have expected, but something, land enough for her sister's family to establish a winter camp, which was not nothing. Which was in fact more than the system had offered before someone with Maude's knowledge of formal documents had helped frame the argument in terms the agent could not easily dismiss. Esteban worked the ranch until 1892, when his knees gave out and he retired to Ridge Creek with Maria, and they came to the ranch every Christmas without fail until old age made the journey too difficult. Cal left in 1889 to try his luck at silver mining, came back broke and cheerful in 1891, and stayed on for another decade before eventually marrying a woman from Ridge Creek and starting his own small place on the eastern edge of the valley, which George had helped him acquire, a favor Cal repaid in labor and in the particular loyalty of a man who knows when someone has given him something real. George McCrae's hair went fully silver by 1893, and Maude told him it was distinguished, which was not flattery because she genuinely thought so. She had her own gray coming in by then, threading through the brown, and he told her it was beautiful, which she could see in his face that he meant. Thomas McCrae grew up knowing the valley the way his father knew it, from the inside out, and he had his mother's quick mind and his father's commitment to the land. And by the time he was 15, he was riding with his father every day and learning the business in the way you can only learn something by doing it for real. Clara McCrae grew up reading everything she could find, and Maude taught her herself, with the same conviction Maude's own father had held about ignorance being a choice. And by the time Clara was 12, she had read her way through every book in George's collection and was agitating for more, which led to a mail order from a bookstore in San Francisco that arrived in 2 crates and kept her occupied for the better part of a year. In the winter of 1893, when Thomas was 6 and Clara was 3, Maude sat down at the kitchen table one evening and wrote a letter. It was addressed to her aunt in St. Louis, the one with the opinions about Maude's life choices, the one she had not spoken to in over 8 years. She wrote the letter carefully, not as a reconciliation performance and not as a triumph, but as an honest account of where she was and what her life had become, offered without expectation. The reply came 6 weeks later, written in her aunt's precise and slightly formal hand. It was shorter than Maude's letter, It said, "I am glad you are well. I am glad you have found something good." I have thought often about what I said when Thomas died. I said things that came from fear rather than love. I regret them. If you ever travel east, the door is open. Maude read it twice and then showed it to George, who read it and handed it back and said, "Are you going to answer?" "Yes," she said. "Eventually." She did answer, and a careful correspondence developed over the following years, not intimate but not cold, two women in their respective lives acknowledging each other across a continent. In the spring of 1895, George and Maude rode to the top of the canyon wall on the eastern side of the valley, which required a long switchback trail and a good horse, and the kind of morning that makes that kind of effort worth it. From the top, the valley spread out below them in its full extent, the green of it in May being the particular shade of green that Maude had decided was her favorite color, because it was the color of a place that had survived a hard winter and come through it. She could see the house from up there, and the barns, and the garden she had put in on the south side of the house that George had helped her fence against deer, and the creek winding bright through the bottom of the valley, and the cattle moving in distant brown clusters through the grass. She thought about everything it had taken to get here, not as inventory of pain, but as acknowledgement that the road had been real. Thomas Brenner, who had been good and kind and had deserved more years. Clara, her first Clara, who had learned to say mama with that sunrise-bright delight. Robert Hale, who had been a decent man in a limited way. The barn in November, the gun in her hand, the cold, the dog. All of it had been real. All of it had happened. None of it had been erased by the existence of this valley, this man beside her, these children, this life. Loss did not get erased. It got companioned. "I am thinking about the barn," she said. George, beside her on his horse, looked at her. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because you get that particular look when you are thinking about the hard way here," he said. "I recognize it because I have the same look when I am thinking about Grace and the boy." She absorbed that. "Does it get easier?" she said, though she knew the answer by now. She just wanted to say the words out loud with him. "No," he said. "It gets different. It gets accompanied." She had not used that word aloud, but he had said the exact thing she had been thinking, which was something that happened between them regularly, and that she had stopped being surprised by and had simply come to accept as one of the gifts of knowing someone all the way down. She reached out and he took her hand the way they did, and they sat on their horses at the top of the canyon wall and looked down at their valley. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I think there might be a third child coming," she said. He turned to look at her fully, and his face did the thing it always did with important news, went very still while he processed it, and then broke into that smile, the full one, the one that made him look young. "Are you certain?" "Not yet," she said. "But I am fairly certain." He laughed, not with surprise exactly, more with the delight of a man who has found that his life keeps giving him reasons to feel that way. "A third," he said. "This valley is going to need more room." "The valley has plenty of room," she said. "I have seen it from up here." He was still smiling. "Yes," he said, "you have a point." She was right about the third child. She usually was. This was a fact that George acknowledged freely and that she did not bother pretending was otherwise. The third child was born in the winter of 1895, the third winter baby, which led George to make a comment about timing that made her laugh out loud in the middle of labor, which the woman attending the birth found alarming but which Maude found exactly right. It was another boy. They named him James, for no one in particular and for both of them in general, a new name for a new life, which felt appropriate. James McCrae arrived with both parents' stubbornness and neither of their patience, which made him extremely entertaining as an infant and slightly exhausting as a toddler. But Maude found, to her own amusement, that she had more patience for this than she had expected, because she had learned over the course of two previous children that the difficult qualities in a young child are often the magnificent qualities in an adult, rearranged by time and experience into something useful. By the turn of the century, The McCrae Ranch had become one of the settled, known things of that part of Nevada, the kind of place that people used as a reference point when giving directions and the kind of family that showed up on the right side of most local disputes. Not powerful in the way Dale Ferris had tried to be powerful, not by acquisition and pressure, but solid in the way that a good stone wall is solid, reliable and boundary-making, and built to last. Maude was 45 in 1900, and she did not feel like what she had expected 45 to feel like, which was something diminished and receding. She felt like herself, specifically and fully herself, in a way that she had not been able to say at 30 or 20 or any age before, because being fully yourself requires knowing what you are, and knowing what you are requires living long enough to find out. She knew what she was now. She was a woman who had survived things that should have broken her and had not because she was heroic, but because survival had been necessary and she had been capable of it. She was a woman who had found, after 31 years of loss, that the world was still capable of giving something back, and who had chosen to accept what was offered and build from it. She was a wife, a mother, a rancher's partner in the complete sense of the word, a neighbor, a reader, a maker of bread that Esteban still described as the best bread he had ever eaten, which he said every Christmas when he came. She was a friend to Nunu, who had built a life in and around the valley that was as secure as any she could have hoped for in a territory that had given her people almost nothing. She was George McCrae's wife, which was a specific identity that she wore not like a subordination but like a partnership, because that was what it was. She had told him who she was on that first night, and she had been telling him ever since, and he had been telling her the same in return. And what they had built between them over 15 years was not a monument but a living thing, continuously tended, occasionally difficult, fundamentally and completely real. One evening in the spring of 1900, she was sitting on the porch in the long May light when George came and sat beside her, which was something they did most evenings when the weather allowed. Thomas was 17 and in the barn. Clara was 13 and somewhere with a book. James was 4 and asleep in the house, exhausted from his own enormous energy. "I have been thinking about the north pasture again," George said. "The fencing," she said. "The fencing. Esteban's replacement is good, but he does not have Esteban's eye for post placement. I think we need to. I looked at it yesterday," she said. "I think the northeast corner is the problem. The soil is soft there in the spring and the posts work loose." He looked at her. "I was going to say the same thing," he said. "I know," she said. "I know how you think." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the valley in the evening light. "After 15 years," he said, "you would think it would stop surprising me when you do that." "And yet," she said. "And yet," he agreed. She rested her head against his shoulder, which she had done on 10,000 evenings and which always felt still, like something deliberate and chosen. He put his arm around her. The valley spread out before them in the May evening, the creek catching the last light, the cattle settled for the night, the canyon walls their deep red gold, the mountains beyond them still wearing their snow in the high places where the cold never completely left. She had come here with nothing, less than nothing. She had come here with a gun and a grief that had no floor and the borrowed shelter of a stranger's barn. She had come here at the end of a long road of loss that had convinced her, thoroughly and almost fatally, that life was a transaction in which she would always be on the wrong side. And this valley had given her back the things the seasons had taken, not the specific things, not Thomas or Clara or the Kansas farm or the green door in Hannibal, because those were gone and the world does not undo its losses, but the capacity for those things, the capacity to belong somewhere. The capacity to love someone without the love being immediately answered by the universe with annihilation. The capacity to wake up in the morning with something to look forward to, not just something to survive. George McCrae had given her back her own trust in herself, which was the most damaged thing she had carried into his barn, more damaged than she had known, the deep belief that she was capable of building something real. He had not given it back by telling her she was capable. He had given it back by treating her, consistently and from the very first morning, as someone whose capacity he had no doubt about. She thought about the dog. About Pepper, who had put her head on Maude's knee in the cold barn, and who was now old and gray-muzzled, and spent most of her days in the warmest corner of the kitchen. The dog had been the first thing. Before George and his lantern and his plain offer of a warm room and a legitimate wage, there had been a dog who walked across a cold barn and put her head on a stranger's knee without any reason except that the stranger seemed to need it. Small things. The smallest things, sometimes, are the turning points. She lifted her head from George's shoulder and looked at him in the evening light, at the face she knew as well as her own hands. "I am very glad I was in your barn," she said. He looked at her with those warm, serious eyes. "I am very glad Pepper got out through the fence," he said. She laughed. He smiled. The creek made its evening sound below them. Inside the house, James would wake up soon and need his supper, and Thomas would come in from the barn with the particular appetite of a 17-year-old who had been working since dawn. And Clara would emerge from wherever she had taken her book and would have something to say about whatever she had been reading and would expect her parents to engage with it seriously, which they would, because that was the kind of house this was. But for now, on the porch in the May evening, in the valley that had given her back everything the seasons had taken, Maude Brenner McCrae sat beside the man she loved and looked at the life she had built and thought, This is what it feels like when the world keeps its debt." The creek ran on. The canyon walls held their color against the darkening sky. The mountains stood. The valley breathed its spring breath, green and cold and alive. And the night came in easy over the McCrae land, over everything that was theirs, over everything that had been found and built and loved in this wide, red-rocked, sky-heavy corner of the American West. And Maude Brenner sat in the middle of it and was, at last, completely and unreservedly home.